What does it mean to be scary? Is it when you first witnessed that zombie in the mansion? Is it when you saw Nemesis pursuing our hero, Jill Valentine? Or maybe the regenerator was your real first taste at being scared of something? No, Resident Evil is not scary anymore. Oh my god! Ladies and gentlemen, what makes a Resident Evil game scary? Maybe the darkness scares you, or maybe getting jump scared is what defines scary for you. Now, I quickly just want to say before I start World War III in the comment section is that this video is mostly opinion based. So while this video is intended to prove as to why I feel like Resident Evil games aren't scary anymore, I also want to state that if you find Resident Evil games scary, then that's totally okay. I'm not going to get mad at anyone for having a different opinion from me. However, I do ask that you watch this whole video and try to understand where I'm coming from. I love Resident Evil games, but I simply don't find them scary anymore. And this video from start to finish is going to fully explain why. So, strap in, equip your shotguns, and let's hop straight into this. Before we jump into the madness, first I want to talk about some good things. I want to talk about some of my scariest moments from Resident Evil. And I gotta say, that jump scare from the dogs in Resident Evil 1 is terrifying. And it really doesn't seem like it, but I'm specifically talking about the HD remake. In the original game, you would go through the hallway and the dogs would jump through. But in the remake, the first time you go through that hallway, the dogs only smack the window. It's not until you come back through that hallway when they actually jump through. Another moment is Resident Evil 2. In the original game, running into the liquor for the first time was absolutely terrifying. Let me also not forget Mr. X. What a menacing and just very creepy enemy. His slow walking and just bursting through walls, it made him seem like he was so terrifying. Now I could sit here and go through every single Resident Evil game and talk about some of my scariest moments from all of the games, which I might do in a future video, but I want to talk about the scariest moment of them all. The regenerators from Resident Evil 4. Now, most of you may say that this is a very overhyped enemy, but it's not the way the regenerator looks that scares me. It's the buildup to those enemies and also the sound that they make. See, if you played Resident Evil 4, right, on your first playthrough, if you read all the files and you looked at the environments, you could really see that environmental buildup. And eventually you walk into that room where you see all these regenerators just lying down and you're wondering, okay, what are these guys? And once you grab the key item, all of a sudden you hear, yeah, I'm sorry, if I was sleeping and all of a sudden I heard that noise in the middle of the night, I'd probably be freaked out too. And last but not least, one of my favorite moments from the entire Resident Evil series combined is the baby scene from Resident Evil 8. I did not expect that scene on my very first playthrough because I went in the game spoiler free, and when I ran into that scene for the first time, I felt like I was playing a completely different game, but I mean that in a good way. Capcom has potential to really scare fans, and although they clearly took inspiration from PT, I really wish Capcom would branch off and make a completely separate horror franchise specifically on psychological horror. But that baby scene is terrifying, and I love the way they executed it, and it's not that complicated. It's something as simple as making the game dark, having red lights, and having this creepy giant like baby thing chase after you. It's creepy, and I love that about that game. Now, let's move on, and I feel like I've heard nobody talk about this, so let me be the first. Resident Evil is not meant to be scary, it's meant to be adrenaline and tension filled. Now, for the newer Resident Evil fans that might disagree with me, let's go all the way back to, in my opinion, the best Resident Evil remake, Resident Evil 1. Take the Crimson Heads for example. Crimson Heads were an enemy where basically if you killed a normal zombie and you came back to the area later in the game, they would basically revive as like this crimson head. They'd look all like reddish and they'd have claws and everything. Think about this for a second. What's the difference between scary and tension? Let's take a scary moment from one of my favorite horror games, Outlast. That scene where you're getting chased down, the music's blasting in your ears, that is not only tension filled, but it's scary. You want to make it to the end of that hallway without getting caught. That is scary. That is a situation that no person would want to be in real life. If you had a mob of people chasing you down with machetes and, you know, just psychotic people, that would be scary. But scary is not the same thing as tension, and I want to explain why. Another example of being scared is not wanting to turn that corner. For example, the baby scene. You run into the baby twice. The first time you encounter him, you have to run back, circle around, and get to the next area, and the baby disappears. And at that point, you are scared because you don't want to progress. You have no idea where the baby's gonna be, and you don't want to move forward. And once you grab that next puzzle piece, guess what? The baby shows up and you're back to being scared. But let's talk about tension now. An example of tension would again be the Crimson Heads. Think about it. The Crimson Heads aren't scary. When you fought that first Crimson Head boss in the dungeon, was it really scary, or was it tension filled because he was aggressive and you don't want to get hit by him? I know it's complicated and some may argue that scary and tension are the same, but I disagree. I feel like being scared is not wanting to move forward, not wanting to progress, not wanting to know what's around that corner. And tension is all atmosphere, and I think that's the best way to summarize it. Scary is the physical fear that you feel, and tension is the atmosphere. And I feel like that's what Resident Evil is known for. Resident Evil isn't a PT. Resident Evil isn't a Silent Hill. It's not always dark. You're not always walking around with the flashlight. You're not always hearing, you know, creepy groans in your ear from zombies and creatures. If you think about it, Resident Evil isn't meant to be scary. It's meant to be tension filled. It's not a game series that constantly wants to poke at your mind and mess with you psychologically. It's a game that builds up tension. Resident Evil 7 is a perfect example of this, which brings me to my next point. What defines scary? Now look, some people find Resident Evil 7 to be one of the scariest games of all time. And if you ask me, I find Resident Evil 7 to be one of the least scariest games of all time. And keep in mind that Resident Evil 7 is in my top 5 RE games of all time. So what truly defines horror? What truly defines the term scary? And this is complicated because again, many people find Resident Evil 7 to be one of the scariest games in the franchise. I said in my last video that if you take a video game and you make the game dark, it doesn't automatically make it scary, at least for me, because for most people, if a game takes place at night, it's scary to them. Take the game Baldi's Basics for example. It takes place during the day, and the game isn't scary because it's horror filled. It's scary because you have all these different enemies coming after you, specifically Baldi. He's got a meter stick that he's slapping against his hand, and the louder it gets, the closer he is to you. But imagine this. Imagine if Baldi's Basics took place at night. It was completely dark. Now all of a sudden, people classify that as a horror game. Because again, a lot of people find Resident Evil 7 to be scary simply because it's at night and it's dark and the lights are off. Imagine this. Imagine you're playing Resident Evil 7 and the entire game takes place during the day. And imagine every time you're indoors, all the lights are on. It's never dark. All of the lights are constantly on. Then would the game be as scary? It's crazy how you could take like some of the most peaceful video games, make them take place at night, and all of a sudden it's the scariest game on the planet to some people. And scary is subjective. Again, some people find Resident Evil 7 to be the scariest, and I find it to be the least scariest. And the reason for that is because to me, I don't get blinded by darkness, no pun intended. Just because these games take place at night doesn't necessarily mean they're good at being scary. To me, what makes Resident Evil 7 so scary is hearing the footsteps of your enemies, much like the original Resident Evil games. Because of fixed camera angles, you couldn't see from all directions. So sometimes you would walk into a room and you would just hear the zombies and you'd hear them stepping on the ground, but you wouldn't actually be able to see them. You would have to move forward and then you would see them. I honestly kind of laughed when I saw people say, that Lady Dimitrescu was one of the scariest enemies out of the entire franchise. Lady Dimitrescu Dimitrescu was a very cool enemy in Resident Evil 8. Her character design was great, and I feel like maybe her motives were okay. But she wasn't scary. She was just a tall vampire lady roaming around the castle, chasing you with giant claws. See, a stalker enemy that really worked well, and in my opinion, worked better than Lady Dimitrescu was Chris Walker from Outlast. And also the doctor. I completely forgot his name, but the doctor with like the giant scissors. These two enemies were much better stalker enemies because the motives that they had were creepier. See, Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil 8 only wanted to hunt you down simply for the sake of the story. Oh, there's a dude roaming our castle. We need to capture him and torture him some more. It almost felt comedic in a way, you know? But if you take Chris Walker or the doctor from Outlast, when they were hunting you down, they didn't want to hunt you down and toy with you and mess around. They wanted to like I don't know if I can say this on YouTube, but they want to like torture you, right? Like they want to do some crazy things to your character. Their motives were creepy. It made you not want to go near those enemies. That tension, that scare was really built up. You're like, no, I am scared of that. I don't want to go near that. But in Resident Evil 8, you had all these content creators and streamers getting closer to Lady Dimitrescu, and I'm like, that takes away the whole point of the game being scary. See, if you want to run towards your enemy, you are not scared. If you want to run away, you are scared, and the tension is there. And that leads me into the whole point of this video, and my last point, why I don't find these games scary anymore. I think one of the biggest problems is that Resident Evil games need to be bigger and better every time. And because these games need to be bigger every time, that compromises the tension. What I mean is, in the original Resident Evil games, they were much smaller, which means you could do a lot more with the scares. The mansion in Resident Evil 1 had a lot of tighter areas, so that was a perfect opportunity to throw in enemies around corners. But then you take a look at Resident Evil Village, and you have all these massive big areas because the game is trying to be a Hollywood movie. And there's nothing wrong with that. Keep in mind, Resident Evil Village is in my top 3 Resident Evil games of all time. So I don't want people to think that, oh, he hates Village, he hates RE7. I feel like I gotta mention that because in my last video, I had people saying that I hate the remakes for some reason, even though I clearly stated 3 times that I don't hate the remakes. So I just don't find these games scary simply because, again, I feel like they're trying to be more like Hollywood films rather than trying to be the, those smaller B-movie films. Resident Evil is not trying to be a Silent Hill. It's not trying to be an Outlast. It's trying to be its own thing, and that's what makes it unique. The older games weren't as dark, and that's mostly because of graphical limitations, but the older games focus more on tension, and that's what made them scarier. But the newer games are just like, oh, how do we make our game scary? Oh, turn off all the lights, make the game take place at night, and boom, we're scaring our fans. And to me, that's just cheap horror, and I simply don't find that scary. I tell it how it is, I give my honest opinion, and that's where you guys come in, because I want to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions down below. That has been it from me, and I will catch all of you in the next one.